This is Elected, a podcast for women and our active accomplices in and around politics. I'm your host, Sarah Elder Chaminara, and today my guest is very exciting. Minister Carla Qualtrough, the MP for Delta and the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge, in the spirit of reconciliation, that it's important for me to share my personal commitment to learning the history of colonialism and the ongoing systemic violence and oppression against Indigenous peoples. The land where I live, work, and record from is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. Hi, Minister Qualtrough.
Hi, nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for giving me your time. I'm very excited to talk with you. I mean, let's just jump right in. So I am very curious to know about, you're a former Paralympian athlete, you're a lawyer by trade, and then you jumped into politics. And I am very curious to know how that leap happened.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And of course, I'm joining you from Delta, BC, the traditional territory of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam First Nations. It's actually quite a story, if if you must know. It wasn't in the cards for me, in the sense that I never planned to run for office. It wasn't something I aspired to. But I've always been deeply interested in policy and systems and changing the world, I guess, for lack of a more lofty way of putting it. And in 2014, I ran for school board here locally. And my kids were quite young. They were only 2 and 4. And I was really interested in education policy, particularly for kids with disabilities. And of course, my background as a human rights lawyer was in disability rights. And I didn't have a clue what I was doing running for school board, but it didn't feel super risky because I could still work and still be at home and still be local, but start to kind of get my foot in the door in terms of local politics. And about 3 days before the election, the then school board chair asked me to go for coffee. And I thought, oh, isn't this nice? She wants to welcome me in case I get elected, and we're going to be on a team together and work to make things better for Delta. And in fact, she gave me a big old reality check and said, I hate to break it to you, but I don't think you're going to be elected in 3 days. But I really think that's the best thing for Delta, because I'm the chair of the Liberal Local Riding Association, and I think you are destined for bigger things. And I really want you to be our candidate next year in the federal election. And so I said, well, let's see what happens on Saturday first. Let me lose this one first. And sure enough, she was right. I think I was 14th out of 17 people. I had no name recognition. I didn't have a machine. But I really was intrigued by her offer. But after thinking about it, I said no. My son was only 2, and they didn't give up on me. They came in and kind of courted me, I guess, 3 or 4 months later. And I said no again. I said I wasn't ready, that I wasn't ready to kind of take this big leap and be away from my kids so much. And they just kept kind of very... they pursued me, and they asked me if I would meet with the then leader, this guy named Justin Trudeau of the Liberal Party, because he was really passionate about disability and wanted to kind of pitch me on being a candidate. And I met with him, and he, I believed and shared his views on what we could do together to make things better for people with disabilities. And I became the candidate, and the rest is kind of history.
It is. And you won in 2015. So that's a really great story.
Well, thank you. And yeah, it was a bit of the little engine that could. We didn't know what we were doing, but with my background in sport, I very strongly believed that I could be coached, and if I followed the team game plan, and if I worked really hard, we had a shot. And I was very fortunate. Of course, there was a momentum for change in the country at the time, and I benefited from that. But I've been reelected twice more, so I think we're doing okay here in Delta.
And how old are your kids now?
Now they're 9 and just turned 12. So this has been their entire life. So they were, my daughter had just turned 5 and my son was turning 3 when I first got elected.
It's interesting because some people, well, and I myself, I'm a mom too, and my kids are 3.5, and one is turning 5 next week. So they're pretty close together in ages and very similar to where you were when at that time as well. And for some women in politics, this can be the greatest reason or why they say no. So do you ever have conversations with women who have kids that are younger and around, how to make that leap and helping them get through that decision-making process?
Yeah. And it certainly is the reason I said no at first. And I said no multiple times because I couldn't imagine figuring it all out organizationally. We also have 2 older children who at the time were 12 and 14. So we had a lot on our plate as a family. And I talked pretty openly with women about the kind of, it's logistics in some ways. It's very kind of organizational, how, we got to be organized as a family. You've got to pursue this life as a team. For my husband and I, this was very much our family making this decision. And I've asked a lot of them and they've had to be super flexible, in terms of what I'm home for, what I'm not home for, when we do what we do as a family. And it can be tough and they have sacrificed, especially my younger kids. But I also have very wonderful stories of what they've been exposed to and the strong leadership opportunities I've had because of their support. And I think, looking back, they'll have seen the bigger world beyond the kind of 4 corners of our community. And hopefully they'll be proud of what I've done and they'll see that they played a really important role in that journey. And they were with me the whole time. I mean, my kids and I are a package deal, even in Delta. If you want to get your MP somewhere, make it family friendly and invite all of us. Because when I'm home, they're with me and they're still young enough to want to be with me.
And when you run your campaigns, is that a family friendly? Is 100%. That something that, yeah,
100%. Every one of my offices has a place for kids to hang out and play. When constituents come to talk to me, there's somebody who can kind of hang out with their children if they need to talk privately or talk with my staff privately. My kids came door knocking with me. I will say that the 3rd election, so last year, the kind of tone and environment of the election was a little more negative. So we protected them a little more. And my daughter was old enough to understand the kind of negativity that was part of the last election. So didn't participate quite as much, but they've got to really be exposed to some really important conversations because of my job and the world I live in. And I'm proud that they've jumped in with me. Not really of their choosing, but they're Team Carla, so it's good.
Well, I think it's also important the fact that you're building inclusive spaces, not only for yourself, but for others that you deal with in your work as an MP and as minister. So, how important is that to you in your work as a politician?
It is, I would say, at the core of everything I do, whether it's, to your point, being family friendly or including families. Like for me, when we do an event with the Liberal Party, I'm the first one to say, okay, but what about our families? I don't want to be away for the weekend. Let's make this family friendly. And if we have to meet as a group, then maybe our families could have a pool party in the hotel, or let's find a way to include. And I feel the same way around the disability file. I mean, my entire life I've been dedicated, and devoted to challenging and refining systems that excluded. And whether it excluded someone because they have a mobility impairment or visual impairment or an intellectual disability, I've done so much thinking around how we can make society more disability inclusive.
So do you mind, I'd like to ask, so in your role as Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, what are the things that you're working on right now that are particular to disability inclusion?
Oh, well, I could talk about this forever. So of course I don't mind. Yeah. But as you probably know, I have a disability. I'm legally blind. And so I have firsthand lived experience about what it feels like to move around and navigate and be part of a world that was built without your needs being considered. And so, so many of us, 23% of Canadians identify as having a disability. And yet, historically, so much of what we've built, physically from a policy point of view, from programs and services, has not taken the needs of people with disabilities in mind. So, I set out on this journey 7 years ago to really upend the system. I was a human rights lawyer, and what I found super frustrating was we have this really strong human rights framework in Canada, but you kind of have to wait till somebody's discriminated against before you can help them. So someone has to be denied a job or denied housing or denied a service, and this whole machine kicks in and there's a process. And then 2 years later, somebody says, yep, you're right, you shouldn't have been denied that house. Well, that's small comfort. It was 2 years ago. It's cost you money and time and energy and emotional despair. And so I really believe we need to put in place systems that stop the discrimination from happening in the first place. And that's where the Accessible Canada Act came in. So the first thing we did as a government, and I did in my role, I was then Minister for Canadians with Disabilities. And even the evolution of my title is a whole fun story in and of itself. But the Accessible Canada Act puts in place a system to put the onus of identifying, removing, and avoiding barriers on the government and on system and instead of on the individual to kind of fight that, right? So, that laid a foundation for disability inclusion in Canada. And so from that, we've been able to put in place an accessibility commissioner at the Human Rights Commission who's going to work on creating these standards. We have put in place, we're just about to release our Disability Inclusion Action Plan, which is a whole series of actions in the 4 areas identified by the disability community: employment, accessible government, accessible communities, that really get at the heart of the discrimination that people face. It's there's a lot of work to be done in this space, and it's quite embarrassing as a country. And we need to kind of own that, that we haven't done right by people with disabilities in the past, and we need to change that, and we need to do it quickly.
Well, and you brought up something that we have Canada's first chief accessibility officer. So someone that I actually used to work with in politics in BC, Stephanie Cadieux, a former MLA and minister. When I worked for the BC Liberal government, she was an MLA as well. Yeah. And so she is, I think, just an exemplary choice for the first person to serve in this role.
And she's you're right. We're so lucky to have her and have her help us build this system. And her role is, sort of as an inaugural role, we're still kind of working through all the kinks of what that will look like. But she's such a strong advocate for people with disabilities. She knows government, she knows systems, she's a systems thinker, but she's also super practical and pragmatic. So she just knows that we can't get caught up in perfect in order to make changes for individuals every day. So it's we're really lucky to have her in that role.
Yeah, I'm super thrilled for her for her to be in that position, but also because of the good things that I know that she'll do on behalf of people with disabilities and Canadians. So something else I wanted to talk to you about, especially on the inclusion piece, is around how do we get more people with disabilities in the political sphere, in the arena. How do we make the spaces and systems for all parties more inclusive, more accessible, and how can I be a better advocate for people with disabilities in that way?
Really important question, and there's a lot of work to be done in that space. There's the age-old dilemma of right now, there's not a lot of us for people to see themselves in. So there's, when I decided to run, I never knew a blind politician before. I knew Stephanie. We've actually got quite a few politicians in BC. I say that, and there's probably 5. And so it's not quite a few when you think the population of the country and how many of us identify as having a disability. But so I think we really have to rethink, and I think this is true for other barriers, but we really need to rethink and unapologetically and confidently provide space for people to participate differently. I think virtual parliament is a huge step forward in terms of making the job more accessible, whether it be for new moms or people with disabilities who can't travel, or people from the north who don't want to leave community. For me, this kind of COVID tested practice of virtual parliament means a lot more Canadians from a bunch of diverse backgrounds can participate. Listen, campaigning as somebody who can't see was really tough. And I can't read name tags. I can't read agendas. I can't recognize faces, like all the hallmarks of politics and politicians. I had to be super direct and honest about my disability. I had to kind of say, hi, Sarah, please, the next time you see me, I might not recognize you because I don't recognize faces, but just say, hi, Carla, it's Sarah, and I'll remember. So I've never been as forthright with my disability. And then you have to kind of confidently separate that from your ability to do the job. And you spend a lot of time convincing people that I can do this job, even though I can't see. So I think, a lot of it is the attitudinal changes, and not letting people get away with what we've always let people get away with, these assumptions we make. And, someone wheels into a room and everybody decides before they've met that person what that person can do and can't do. And it's the same with someone who has a cane or a dog. And you've already, you've got these preconceived notions about someone's capacities and abilities and strengths and weaknesses. And it's unfair. And it's discriminatory and it's real bias. So I think we need to all be very open to doing things differently. And that will be better, by the way, for sure. But, it's having our all candidates meetings in accessible venues. I have a practice of not doing an all candidate meeting if it's not in an accessible space. But it's risky, because if you don't show up as a candidate, people think you don't care or you don't want to be there. When for me, it's taking a stand on something I believe in. But you know what? They changed the venues when I said that. So, it's making your campaign offices accessible, your MP offices accessible. I can guarantee you there's tens of MP offices in Canada. Maybe I wouldn't say hundreds because I don't know, I haven't done it, but there's a lot of MP. My predecessor, her office was inaccessible, so I changed offices when I was elected. It's just kind of being aware of the barriers we put in place that exclude.
Do you find that your colleagues in the House of Commons are open to hearing and learning about these different things and about creating, more inclusive spaces, or there are still some barriers that need to be overcome there as well?
I think that's probably a yes, no. So I think that people are open for sure, because we all like to think of ourselves as being open-minded and caring and inclusive, especially here in Canada. It's actually a hard thing to kind of get people to understand, is that we have these, unconscious biases, and we have these kind of preconceived understanding or assumptions about people. Listen, the House of Commons isn't accessible. It's more accessible now, and it certainly wasn't built for a blind MP. A lot of what's done in the House is visual. So the speaker will nod at you if the time is up. The speaker will nod at you to tell you to stand up. You have to be able to see down the row to see when you have to stand up to vote. People are always making gestures across the way. So for me, again, it's been this constant education and reminder, partially because my disability sometimes can be invisible. People forget I can't see very well. But even with my glasses on, I only have 10% vision. So that's not a lot. But absolutely, I do believe that the cohort of MPs in this country want to be more inclusive. I don't know that they quite yet have ingrained that means they have to change their behavior. So the interest is there, but the action is still a work in progress, I'd say.
Well, it's interesting. So you bring the physical space of the House of Commons, and its lack of accessibility in some ways. So it's currently under renovation.
Yep.
Is that something that's being taken into consideration?
Yeah. So I happen to have been the Minister of Public Services and Procurement when we approved the design, and we actually are making it to as universal as we can. There's a few exceptions of spaces like getting up to the clock tower and what have you. But the idea is right now there's probably 2 or 3 places on the floor of the House of Commons where someone in a wheelchair could could participate, and we want to increase that, 100-fold. And so, yes, absolutely. As we work on center block renovations, and even as we renovated West Block to accommodate the House of Commons for the next 10 years, it's much improved. But there's always more. And part of the challenge is, again, this has never been done. And so people think, okay, I've got a ramp, tick, we've got it made. But where do you put sign language interpreters? Where do you put tactile signage? Where do you do your wayfinding? So it's not just a ramp, and it's certainly not a ramp into the back door, by the way. It's a confidently placed, accessible front door for everybody. But you got to be vigilant. Like, that's all I can say about this file is you just got to be vigilant and super stubborn. And it's happening. And we've come a long way since I've been, in this job.
Yeah, I think it's great to hear that there are changes coming. I think a lot of it is, breaking down, as you said, the biases, the unconscious biases around, that we have. And for, we don't like acknowledging, I think personally, that we don't understand something or have thought one way and, now have the opportunity to be educated and to do better. That kind of learning can be uncomfortable, but it's so necessary.
Yeah. And like other human rights movements, there's an evolution, right? And in some ways, like, the women's movement, our efforts around reconciliation and Indigenous reconciliation, is like, we got to own what we've done. And I think in a lot of ways, Canada and Canadians, it isn't top of mind how poorly we've treated our citizens with disabilities, right? We institutionalized people. At one point in our history, sign language was against the law. We sterilized people, we lobotomized people, like we did really bad things to people because they had disabilities. And it's not a history that's well known, and kind of the trauma of that, the trauma of being poked and prodded and told all your life that you're broken and that you need to be fixed. And I'm the person to fix you. And I know what's best for you. And like, there's a whole bunch of work that needs to be done, getting to the root of this and kind of acknowledging and owning this as a country so we can move forward equitably.
Well, and I also think in the past, especially in my work through Madam Premier in the store, there have been a lot of people who have been using and coming to understand what it means to be ableist.
Yeah.
And how you may be well-intentioned, but you're actually being ableist. Can you speak to that at all?
Oh, yeah. I sure can. Listen, I'm going to even call you out on the language. I don't say ableist, I say disableist, partially because I feel like we don't even own our own discrimination. Like if you say discrimination on the basis of race, it's racism. If it's on the basis of sex, it's sexism. But if it's on the basis of disability, it's ableism. Like it's in favor of being able. And disability and ability aren't opposites. I have a ton of abilities, right? So for me, but you know what? Everybody has their own language. Even within the disability community, there's a lot of variety and a spectrum of language users. But it is, as someone with a disability, and of course, the more complex your needs are and the more severe and the more apparent your disability is, the heightened your experiences of discrimination will be. You always feel like you don't quite fit in, and people make you feel like you don't belong, and that they're doing you a favor if they're giving you access to something that somebody has an entitlement to, for lack of a better word. And I think that kind of these assumptions because that's kind of my word of the day, it feels like these assumptions people make are really harmful. One of the hottest topics in this country in disability rights is medical assistance in dying. And it's a really difficult conversation that is existential for many persons with disabilities, because they rightly feel at times that the message is being sent that life with disability is not worth living and death is better. And how many times have you heard that? Oh my God, that car accident, if that ever happened to me, I'd rather be dead. Or how can you not drive? Like, I get this, I don't drive. How can you not drive? I'd die if I couldn't drive. Well, I live a pretty happy life and I can't drive. But these kind of microaggression type messaging that people get about the quality of life you live as somebody with a disability, and the just the lack of joy that must be in your life because you suffer so greatly. But it's not true. It's simply not true.
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go in terms of having these conversations, and I think also having them openly, so that we can reduce the stigma and create the opportunity for learning. Because these aren't conversations that I was having as a kid, for example. We didn't have these conversations in school or even in university. It really is something that we need to kind of let the sun shine on.
Yeah. It makes people uncomfortable, and we're Canadian. We don't like people. We don't like to make people uncomfortable, right? Like, we just don't want to have those difficult conversations that might kind of make you uncomfortable. But that's how we're going to move forward, is by kind of owning this, right?
Well, and I mean, personally, professionally, in every way, it's often the moments that are the hardest where I find I get the most learning from. It's about how you move through that, and the lessons you take, and the reflection that you can allow on that. And so I think it's if we can all maybe lower our defenses, our personal defense systems a little bit, and we would the opportunity to learn is definitely there.
Well, and the opportunity to grow.
Yeah.
Right? Like, people with disabilities are some of the most creative, innovative, thoughtful problem solvers. There's so much kind of talent and experience and humanity that is being sidelined right now because of these barriers and these biases. It's such a joy to have someone working with you, or on a date with you, or whatever the environment is that isn't like you, that might bring a different perspective to the way you see the world, and that's a good thing, right? It's just another layer of diversity that enriches any experience.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and it's something that I am still learning about. And I say that as both, something that I know I need to do more on. And so it's conversations like this, not only the one that we're having, but anyone who's listening to this, maybe it'll give them an opportunity to reflect on things as well. And, be more open to learning and having those conversations. So I really want to thank you for speaking with me today. You live in a beautiful riding.
Thank you. I agree.
Yes. It's just been such a pleasure to chat with you today. And, hopefully at some point our paths will cross. And we can have this conversation in a different way. Maybe I would love to leave the door open to have these conversations with more people and to make them more broad, because I think, especially on the piece about electing more persons with disabilities, that's something that is missing from the space right now in terms of conversations around, changing this, eliminating the status quo, and that piece has to be built into it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for being interested in this really important conversation. I think that this has just been wonderful. So I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.